January 1944. Western Europe is cold, gray, and soaked with rain. Inside a German field headquarters, maps cover the walls. Red and blue pins crowd northern France, Italy, the Atlantic coast. An officer stands near a table, reading a fresh report delivered only minutes earlier. His voice is low, controlled, but the numbers on the page refuse to cooperate. American aircraft losses over Germany, heavy. American tank losses in Italy, severe. American ships sunk in the Atlantic, significant. And yet, the follow-up lines are worse. Replacement units already en route. New aircraft squadrons formed. Fresh armored divisions arriving ahead of schedule. Around the room, no one speaks. These are not rumors from the front. They are confirmed intelligence summaries, compiled from reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and battlefield observation. The United States is not slowing down. It is accelerating. For years, German commanders have believed industrial war had limits, that factories could be bombed, that manpower could be exhausted, that losses, heavy enough, would force any enemy to pause. But the reports on the table suggest something deeply unsettling. Every time American forces are destroyed, they seem to return larger than before. And as the winter of 1944 deepens, German command begins to realize that this war is no longer being decided by tactics alone, but by something far larger, far deeper, and almost impossible to stop. That realization leads directly to how this moment came to exist. Long before American tanks rolled onto European soil, German commanders believed they understood the limits of the United States. Their assumptions were rooted in memory. In 1917, America had entered the First World War late. Its army arrived inexperienced, poorly equipped by European standards, and dependent on Allied guidance. German officers who survived that war carried the impression forward. America possessed potential, but not readiness. Power, but not endurance. During the interwar years, those beliefs hardened. Germany rebuilt its military culture around efficiency, specialization, and technical superiority. Weapons were designed by skilled engineers, produced in controlled numbers, refined constantly. The Panzer divisions, the Luftwaffe, and the U-boat arm were conceived as instruments of precision, sharp, fast, and decisive. War, as German doctrine understood it, would be won quickly, before economies could grind, before factories could matter more than generals. The United States seemed the opposite. Across the Atlantic stood a nation focused on consumer goods, mass entertainment, and civilian prosperity. Its factories built cars, refrigerators, radios. Its military budget before 1939 was smaller than that of several European powers. Its army ranked behind Portugal in size. Its officer corps lacked recent combat experience. To German planners, America looked unfocused, rich, but soft. Even after war erupted in Europe in September 1939, German intelligence assessments remained dismissive. Reports describe American industry as powerful but politically constrained. Isolation of sentiment, labor disputes, and a lack of urgency appeared to limit mobilization. The United States supplied Britain with weapons and materials, but at arm's length, through programs like Lend-Lease. To German eyes, this confirmed their theory. America could support war, but not sustain it directly. Inside the German High Command, production was treated as a finite race. Every nation, they believed, possessed a peak output, after which shortages, labor fatigue, and resource limits would force decline. German strategy aimed to win before that peak mattered. Blitzkrieg was not just tactical doctrine. It was economic logic. That logic shaped early campaigns. In Poland, France, and the Low Countries, speed crushed resistance. In 1941, Operation Barbarossa followed the same assumption: destroy the enemy's ability to fight before industrial depth could compensate. When Germany turned toward the Soviet Union, the gamble was enormous, but familiar. Victory would come quickly, or not at all. America, still officially neutral, barely registered as a battlefield threat. Even after German submarines began encountering U.S. ships in the Atlantic, the encounters reinforced old beliefs. Early American destroyers lacked coordination. Convoys were poorly defended. U-boats sank ships at alarming rates. To German naval commanders, this looked like confirmation. The Americans were late again, unprepared again, learning again. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor shattered American isolation overnight. Germany declared war days later, assuming, incorrectly, that Japan's strike had weakened the United States at its core. German leaders believed the blow would delay American entry into Europe by years. What they did not yet understand was that something far more dangerous had been unleashed. America did not mobilize gradually. It mobilized completely. Factories that once built automobiles were scheduled for conversion within weeks. Shipyards expanded at unprecedented speed. Training camps multiplied across the continent. By mid-1942, the scale of American industrial reorientation had no historical precedent. German intelligence noticed the numbers, but dismissed the meaning. Production targets, they believed, were theoretical. Raw materials would bottleneck. Skilled labor would slow expansion. Coordination would fail. No nation could transform civilian industry into war production without collapse. Germany had never seen it done before. And so, even as American equipment began appearing in North Africa in 1942, Sherman tanks, transport trucks, artillery, German commanders interpreted the influx as temporary, a surge, a burst that would fade once losses mounted. They assumed that attrition would do what bombs and submarines could not. That assumption would soon collide with reality, because by the time American forces entered sustained combat, the war economy behind them was no longer experimental. It was relentless. By early 1942, the United States was no longer preparing for war. It was reorganizing itself around it. What German commanders struggled to grasp was that American mobilization did not rely on incremental growth. It relied on conversion. Entire sectors of civilian life were redirected with speed and scale that defied European experience. Automobile plants in Detroit halted consumer production and reopened as tank and aircraft engine factories. Refrigerator manufacturers shifted to producing machine gun parts. Typewriter companies began assembling bomb sites. This was not improvisation. It was coordination. The U.S. government created centralized agencies to control priorities, raw materials, labor allocation, and transportation. The War Production Board dictated what could be built and where. Contracts were standardized. Designs were simplified. Speed replaced elegance. Quantity replaced refinement. To German engineers, this approach appeared crude. American tanks, especially the M4 Sherman, were criticized in German reports for thinner armor and less powerful guns compared to the Panther or Tiger. American aircraft lacked some of the refined engineering seen in German fighters. U.S. weapons are described as adequate, not exceptional, but German analysts missed the deeper pattern. American equipment was designed to be produced quickly, repaired easily, and replaced without hesitation. Parts were interchangeable across factories, thousands of miles apart. Crews could be trained faster. Vehicles could be shipped, unloaded, repaired, and returned to service with minimal delay. German industry could not replicate this. Germany's war economy, constrained by bombing, labor shortages, and internal competition between agencies, struggled to standardize. New weapon designs were introduced even as older ones remained in service, complicating maintenance and supply. Skilled labor was irreplaceable. When factories were damaged, production halted. In contrast, American factories absorbed losses almost invisibly. When German U-boats intensified attacks along the U.S. East Coast in early 1942, sinking dozens of ships, German naval commanders believed they had struck a decisive blow. Shipping losses appeared catastrophic. But within months, American shipyards began launching Liberty ships faster than they could be sunk. Some were completed in weeks. To German intelligence officers reading these reports, the numbers seemed exaggerated. Reconnaissance pilots confirmed new holes in harbors. Submarine crews reported fresh convoys appearing immediately after attacks. Sinkings that once crippled supply lines now produced no visible effect. The same pattern emerged in the air. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were losing hundreds of bombers over Germany. The cost was staggering. German fighter pilots believed attrition would eventually force the Americans to halt daylight bombing. Losses, they reasoned, were unsustainable. But American bomber formations returned again, and again, and again. New air groups replaced destroyed ones almost immediately. Aircraft types evolved without disrupting output. Crew training pipelines expanded rather than slowed. Where Germany struggled to replace experienced pilots, the United States replaced entire units. This imbalance extended to the ground war. In North Africa, American forces absorbed painful defeats in early engagements. Tanks burned, units retreated. German commanders took these moments as proof that American armies would break under pressure. Instead, the defeats were analyzed, absorbed, and compensated for. Within months, American formations returned with improved coordination, better logistics, and greater numbers. Equipment losses did not reduce combat power. They triggered replenishment. By late 1943, German field commanders were filing increasingly anxious reports. Battles that should have weakened the enemy instead strengthened him. Every engagement with American forces produced a paradox: destruction without depletion. What German planners had not anticipated was the psychological effect of endless replacement. Losses no longer discouraged American operations. They accelerated them. The knowledge that equipment, fuel, ammunition, and personnel would arrive on schedule changed how American commanders planned offensives. Risk tolerance increased. Momentum became doctrine. For the first time, German command began to suspect that this was not merely industrial strength, but a different philosophy of war. A war in which endurance mattered more than brilliance. A war in which replacement mattered more than preservation. And as American forces prepared for the largest amphibious operation in history, that realization became impossible to ignore. Because on the battlefield, German commanders were about to confront the consequences of a war economy that never paused. Angle 1. German tank commanders and the arithmetic of loss. On the battlefields of Italy and Western Europe, German armored officers began to notice a pattern that defied logic. American tanks were destroyed in large numbers. Shermans burned along roadsides. Turrets were blown off. Entire units were knocked out in single engagements. By traditional measures, this should have weakened the enemy. It did not. Within days, sometimes hours, new American tanks appeared. Not as replacements pieced together from reserves, but as fully formed units arriving with fuel, ammunition, and trained crews. German tank commanders reported destroying dozens of vehicles only to face equal or greater numbers in the next engagement. The Sherman was not feared for its armor or firepower. It was feared for its availability. German reports began to describe American armor as unexhaustible. Even when Panthers and Tigers achieved tactical success, those victories failed to produce strategic effect. The battlefield reset itself, always in America's favor. Angle 2. The Luftwaffe and the shock of replacement in the air. The air war produced the same realization, but faster. German fighter pilots initially welcomed American daylight bombing. They believed heavy losses would force a retreat to nighttime operations, where accuracy would suffer. Early victories reinforced that belief. Then the Americans returned. Bomber formations grew larger. Escort fighters extended their range. Aircraft lost 1 week, were replaced the next. Airfields destroyed by bombing were repaired. Crews killed or captured were replaced by new squadrons trained thousands of miles away. German commanders began to understand that they were not fighting units. They were fighting a system. Where Germany lost irreplaceable veteran pilots, America replaced experience with scale. Training hours increased. Aircraft production rose. Losses were calculated, accepted, and absorbed. Attrition, once Germany's weapon, now worked against it. Angle 3. U-boats versus shipyards. Nowhere was the imbalance clearer than at sea. German submarines continued sinking American and Allied shipping throughout 1942 and 1943. Individual patrols reported impressive tallies. Yet the strategic effect vanished. American shipyards launched vessels faster than U-boats could destroy them. Liberty ships appeared in convoys almost immediately after losses. Tankers, troop transports, and supply ships multiplied across the Atlantic. German naval intelligence began receiving reports that bordered on disbelief. Sinkings that once paralyzed Britain now barely registered. The ocean, once a battleground, became a highway. The U-boat arm was fighting a losing equation. For every German submarine lost, replacements were slow and costly. For every American ship sunk, two more followed. By the end of 1943, German commanders no longer spoke of victory at sea, only survival. And across land, air, and ocean, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not a contest of tactics anymore. It was a contest of replacement. That realization would soon extend beyond weapons, to the men who used them and the psychology of a war that Germany could no longer control. Angle 4, logistics and spare parts, the invisible arsenal. German planners initially assumed that destroying American vehicles and aircraft would create long-term shortages. Yet reports from the front told a different story. Every Sherman knocked out was often replaced within days. Fuel and ammunition arrived without interruption. Broken tanks were repaired and returned to combat. Crew shortages were mitigated by training programs that produced hundreds of replacements each month. German officers began to see that America's advantage was not only in numbers, it was in the supply chain. Factories, railways, and ports functioned as a single coordinated network. Damage to one node slowed production briefly, but never halted it. The system was resilient, redundant, and relentless. Even German sabotage operations, designed to disrupt logistics, had minimal effect. Ships sank, trains derailed, and factories were bombed, yet the American machine absorbed the damage and kept moving forward. To German eyes, it was almost inhuman. Angle 5, the psychological impact on German commanders. The constant replenishment of American forces inflicted a less tangible, but equally critical blow: morale. Commanders who had been confident after successful battles began to doubt their own assessments. Strategic victories felt temporary, tactical successes fleeting. Reports in the front carried a common refrain: the Americans replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. Notes from the Wehrmacht High Command show a growing frustration, shock at the pace and scale of industrial war. For the first time, German officers openly questioned whether their strategies, honed in Europe and Russia, were capable of producing meaningful long-term results. Letters between commanders reveal unease, a recognition that no single battle could decisively weaken the Americans. Every loss inflicted only highlighted the enemy's depth. It became clear Germany was fighting not just soldiers, but an entire industrial nation. Angle 6, moral contrast, exhaustion versus endless production. On the battlefield, German soldiers experienced the consequences of this imbalance daily. Exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and equipment shortages contrasted sharply with a seemingly endless stream of American replacements. While German units were rotated, patched together, or abandoned, American forces arrived fully equipped, trained, and prepared. The disparity was evident in both equipment and human resources. German units were worn down by attrition, while American divisions gained experience with each engagement. Losses that would have crippled smaller nations barely slowed U.S. operations. German officers began to note that the Americans fought not only with superior numbers, but with a confidence born of certainty. They knew replacements were coming. They knew their supply lines were unbroken. They knew the war machine behind them could absorb staggering losses. For German commanders, this combination of relentless production, logistics mastery, and morale resilience created a profound sense of disbelief. No amount of tactical skill could offset a system that repaired itself as quickly as it was damaged. And as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, this realization would become undeniable. German commanders, watching reports of fresh divisions, aircraft, and tanks arriving on the continent, understood that the war had shifted in a way they could not reverse. This understanding would set the stage for the decisive moment when American industrial power directly dictated the outcome on the battlefield. Summer 1944. Normandy. The invasion had begun on June 6, but the weeks that followed revealed a pattern that German commanders could no longer ignore. American divisions poured onto beaches, equipped with vehicles, artillery, and supplies that seemed to appear endlessly. Every tank destroyed in hedgerows was replaced. Every artillery position silenced was soon reinforced. German officers documented a reality they had once assumed impossible. Reports from the front described the attrition of German forces as catastrophic. Panzer divisions fought in repeated engagements, often with diminished numbers. Yet American Shermans continued to arrive in successive waves. The 2nd Armored Division, for example, had lost dozens of tanks in Bocage, yet new units were deployed within days, equipped and manned. The arithmetic of the battlefield had shifted. Losses no longer dictated outcome. Production did. Air support compounded the shock. The 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaigns destroyed rail lines, factories, and depots in northern France. Yet German intelligence noted an immediate rebound. Aircraft lost in combat were replaced, repair depots restored damaged planes, and new crews arrived with alarming frequency. German fighter pilots and command staffs began recording phrases like unrelenting and inexhaustible in operational reports. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic illustrated the same principle. U-boat commanders sank convoys in dramatic numbers, yet the United States shipyards produced more vessels than could be destroyed. Liberty ships, corvettes, and tankers appeared in ports as quickly as submarines could report losses. German naval command struggled to quantify the effect of their successes. Every sinking seemed tactical, but strategically meaningless. Even small engagements highlighted the scale of American efficiency. Skirmishes in hedgerows, river crossings, and coastal towns revealed a logistical backbone that Germany could not disrupt. Fuel depots rebuilt overnight. Ammunition trucks replenished artillery units, and replacement infantry divisions marched forward with near-clockwork reliability. On July 20th, intelligence reports compiled at Aubry, West in France, reached an unnerving conclusion. Not only were American losses being replaced, they were often replaced faster than Germany could inflict them. Every tactical victory the Wehrmacht achieved was temporary. Every calculated strike against American forces only revealed the depth of the industrial machine supporting them. German command papers began to show a growing disbelief. Notes from Panzergruppe West commented that the Americans fight not only with weapons, but with factories behind them. Luftwaffe generals remarked on the staggering resilience of the 8th Air Force, noting that even when large numbers of bombers were shot down, formations returned undiminished. Naval intelligence added that Liberty ship production rates were unmatched by any previous European conflict. The cumulative effect on German morale was profound. Officers used terms like beyond comprehension and unreal to describe their encounters with American forces. Losses that would have been decisive against other nations were absorbed, compensated for, and eclipsed by American industrial capacity. By mid-July, German planners acknowledged a grim truth. Their earlier assumptions that attrition, tactical brilliance, and selective bombing could wear down the Americans were invalid. America's ability to replace losses rapidly, to train new crews, and to deploy equipment efficiently created a battlefield equilibrium that Germany could not break. Every report reinforced the same conclusion. Germany was facing an opponent whose strength could not be exhausted through conventional means. The war was no longer a contest of individual battles. It was a contest of replacement, endurance, and industrial willpower. And in this realization, German commanders began to understand the scale of the challenge they faced. The Allies' production capabilities had become the decisive weapon, one that no tactical maneuver or local victory could overcome. The stage was set for the irreversible turning point, where American industrial power directly dictated the trajectory of the conflict. By late 1944, German commanders had no illusions left. Reports from the front were consistent. American forces, despite suffering heavy losses, returned stronger and more numerous than before. The Normandy hedgerows had been cleared, but the cost of the Germans was disproportionate. Every panzer division weakened by attrition faced fresh enemy armor just days later. Every town reclaimed by German forces was retaken by Americans almost immediately. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, documented in internal reports the staggering numbers behind the Allied war machine. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 88,000 aircraft, nearly 100,000 tanks and vehicles combined, and millions of tons of ships and equipment. German planners realized these numbers dwarfed their own outputs. Even when factories were destroyed by bombing raids, American industrial recovery was rapid, resilient to a degree Germany had never prepared for. On the Western Front, reports from OB West noted the psychological toll this replacement rate had on frontline officers. Colonels and generals observed that no matter how much ground they retook or how many enemy units they destroyed, American forces seemed impervious to attrition. Phrases like, "enemy appears inexhaustible," began appearing in operational briefings. Tactical victories were fleeting. Even when German artillery destroyed convoys or airstrikes eliminated armored units, new reinforcements arrived before the front stabilized. In Italy, the Fifth Army's advance further demonstrated the systemic advantage. American infantry and armor, supported by artillery and air cover, continually pressed German defenses. Tanks destroyed in one engagement were replaced in a matter of days. New artillery and logistical support units were already advancing. German commanders could not anticipate the scale or speed of the American replenishment system. Every local defeat, they now realized, had strategic implications. The Americans could sustain casualties without disrupting operational momentum. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic illustrated the same inevitability. U-boat commanders sank thousands of tons of cargo, yet for every ship destroyed, another replaced it. Shipyards along the East Coast launched vessels at rates that made attrition largely irrelevant. German planners were forced to recognize that no number of sinkings would halt American supply lines. They were fighting a war against production itself. By December 1944, German operational assessments had shifted. Reports explicitly noted that Allied strength was no longer measured solely in manpower or frontline units, but in the ability to replace what was lost. The arithmetic of war had changed. For every aircraft, tank, or ship Germany destroyed, two more were already en route. German commanders began to understand that attrition was no longer their advantage. It had become a liability, as each loss underscored the impossibility of halting the American war machine. The realization was unmistakable. The U.S. industrial system was a weapon in itself. German tactical brilliance could win engagements, but strategic victory was slipping beyond reach. Battles that once would have determined the course of campaigns now only delayed the inevitable. The Americans' ability to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them had become the decisive factor in the European theater. In reports compiled for Hitler, German generals wrote with an unusual frankness. The enemy was inexhaustible, resilient, and supremely organized. The calculation that underpinned the blitzkrieg, rapid, decisive action to paralyze an opponent, was now irrelevant. No single engagement could tip the balance. The balance had already shifted. As winter approached, and as Allied forces pressed through France and into the Low Countries, German commanders faced a chilling conclusion. The war was no longer winnable by conventional measures. The American production system, factories, labor, logistics, and supply chains, had become the ultimate instrument of war, and German forces were unequipped to counter it. From Normandy to the Italian front, from the skies over Germany to the convoys of the Atlantic, the outcome was now dictated not by battlefield heroics alone, but by an industrial machine that replaced losses faster than any human or weapon could destroy them. By early 1945, the consequences of American production supremacy were undeniable across every theater of war. German units, once confident in their ability to exploit tactical victories, faced a relentless adversary whose losses were temporary and whose reinforcements were inexhaustible. The front line became a grim testament not to heroism or ingenuity alone, but to the scale of industry and logistics behind the U.S. forces. In Western Europe, Panzer divisions had been systematically worn down. The 1st and 2nd Panzer armies, once feared across the continent, could no longer field sufficient armor to contest Allied advances. Even when they regrouped, the Americans had already replaced the units they had destroyed. Reports from German command noted a disturbing trend. Each engagement inflicted casualties, yet did not reduce American operational capacity. Instead, it seemed only to sharpen their resolve and coordination. The Allied bombing campaign had compounded this effect. German factories, transport hubs, and depots were increasingly vulnerable. Yet the Americans demonstrated capacity to rebuild, reroute, and continue supply lines with minimal interruption. Aircraft shot down over Germany were replaced. New squadrons appeared faster than German fighters could engage them. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was largely incapable of contesting Allied air superiority. Not due to lack of skill or courage, but because the system it faced could absorb losses the German system could not. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively. German U-boats, once menacing predators, were overwhelmed by a combination of Allied escort strategies, radar technology, and continuous ship production. For every vessel sunk, American shipyards produced multiple replacements. Convoys maintained their schedules, and supplies reached front lines with astonishing reliability. German naval intelligence recognized that attrition had become strategically meaningless. Losses no longer threatened Allied operations. The human toll of this imbalance was equally stark. German soldiers endured exhaustion, equipment shortages, and dwindling morale, while facing an opponent who could replace men and material with machine-like precision. Notes in the front lines described the frustration and disbelief of officers who, after achieving tactical successes, watched the Americans recover and advance with the same unyielding momentum. For the first time, battlefield heroics could not counter systemic advantage. Industrial output figures provide a clear, indisputable illustration. By 1944, the United States had produced over 88,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks and vehicles, and millions of tons of ships. German production, hampered by bombing and labor shortages, could not match these numbers. Even the most optimistic forecast by German planners underestimated the capacity of American industry. The scale of replacement became the decisive factor on the battlefield. Strategically, this imbalance forced German commanders into reactive positions. They could plan counterattacks and defensive maneuvers, but each engagement only confirmed that the Americans were capable of sustaining momentum. By late 1944, German reports openly acknowledged a new reality. The war was no longer being decided solely by tactics or skill, but by the capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could exploit them. Every battlefield decision was overshadowed by this systemic disadvantage. The psychological effect extended beyond the front lines. Hitler's directives became increasingly desperate, demanding miracles from units that lacked both men and equipment. Commanders at the operational level documented a profound sense of inevitability. No matter how well they fought, the Americans' industrial machine ensured a constant influx of forces and supplies. Attrition no longer favored Germany. It favored a nation with a deeper, faster, and more adaptable production network. And as winter receded and Allied forces prepared for final campaigns into the German heartland, the consequences of this industrial dominance became impossible to ignore. The scale of replacement had shifted the war's trajectory, ensuring that German tactical successes were transient, while American operational capability remained unbroken. This growing imbalance set the stage for the final phase of conflict, where German resistance could not match the sustained power of an industrially unstoppable opponent. By spring 1945, the reality of American production dominance was clear in every theater. German forces, already depleted from months of continuous combat, faced an enemy whose numbers and equipment could not be exhausted. Frontline commanders noted with unease that no matter how many divisions they destroyed, new American units always replaced them. Every victory seemed temporary, every defensive line fragile. Quantifiable comparisons underscored the imbalance. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories produced nearly 50,000 aircraft, over 100,000 vehicles, including tanks and armored personnel carriers, and more than 7 million tons of merchant shipping. German production, constrained by resource shortages, bombing, and labor limitations, could not approach these figures. Even when factories were relocated or expanded, the output could not match the relentless American pace. German planners referred repeatedly to the endless enemy, a phrase that captured the frustration of fighting a foe whose losses never seemed to matter. The battlefield consequences were immediate. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, German units initially achieved tactical surprise, but American forces replaced lost tanks and artillery faster than the Germans could exploit the attack. Reinforcements arrived from behind the front, and supply lines remained intact. In Italy, the Fifth Army advanced steadily despite high casualties. Every artillery or tank loss was quickly remedied, and replacements arrived trained, well-equipped, and ready for combat. On the Eastern Front, the combination of U.S. Lend-Lease shipments and Soviet advances further compounded Germany's inability to regain strategic advantage. Morale within German ranks reflected the operational strain. Reports from field commanders and intelligence officers described disbelief and anxiety. Veteran Panzer commanders lamented that even when German tactics succeeded, the Americans' logistical and production efficiency made success fleeting. Speeches and diaries indicate that officers increasingly saw the war as unwinnable, not due to courage, skill, or strategy, but because the industrial capacity of the United States created a system Germany could not break. Every calculation, every plan, every expectation had to account for a foe that replenished losses at a speed Germany could never match. American planners were aware, though often understated, of the psychological effect of their production system. The knowledge that every loss was replaced allowed commanders to adopt bolder strategies, absorb battlefield setbacks, and maintain offensive momentum. Whereas German operations were increasingly dictated by resource limitations and repair backlogs, American forces could sustain pressure indefinitely. This systemic advantage ensured that the strategic initiative remained firmly in Allied hands. In post-war reflections, German military analysts confirmed the decisive role of American production. Albert Speer and other planners acknowledged that Germany's failure to match the United States' industrial output had been catastrophic. The sheer scale and speed of replacement, factories, vehicles, aircraft, and trained personnel, meant that attrition, the traditional instrument of warfare, no longer worked against the Americans. Instead, it highlighted the futility of Germany's position, demonstrating that tactical brilliance alone could not overcome systemic disparity. By May 1945, as Allied forces crossed into central Germany and Berlin fell, the strategic lesson was unambiguous. German commanders had underestimated the depth and resilience of American industrial power. Their assumptions about attrition, battlefield victories, and the limitations of enemy production had been shattered. The war, in essence, had been lost not only on the battlefield but in the factories, shipyards, and assembly lines thousands of miles away. This industrial imbalance, the relentless replacement of losses, and the psychological impact on German commanders would leave a lasting imprint on military strategy, proving that wars of attrition are ultimately won not just by skill or valor, but by the power to sustain, replace, and endure. The story of German commanders underestimating American production reveals a lesson that transcends individual battles. Wars are not decided solely by courage, tactics, or innovation on the front lines. They are decided by the ability to sustain operations, to absorb losses, and to replace what is destroyed. The United States, through an industrial system of unprecedented scale and coordination, demonstrated that endurance could be as lethal as any weapon. American factories, shipyards, and training camps function as extensions of the battlefield itself. Each tank rolling off an assembly line, each aircraft launched from a production plant, became a soldier in its own right. Replacement was no longer a logistical detail. It was strategy, morale, and power incarnate. German officers, trained to measure success in tactical victories, found themselves confronting an opponent whose strength could not be diminished through attrition alone. Every action taken against American forces only revealed the depth and resilience behind them. This reality reshaped the course of the war. Normandy, the Italian campaigns, the Battle of the Bulge. Each engagement reflected not merely the bravery or skill of soldiers, but the invisible war waged in factories, shipyards, and training centers across the Atlantic. By the time German commanders recognized the scale of American production, it was too late. Their assumptions about limitations, attrition, and endurance had been upended by a system designed to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. In the larger context of history, this lesson endures. Industrial capacity, logistics, and sustained output remain decisive factors in modern warfare. The ability to replace, reinforce, and maintain operational momentum can outweigh individual tactical brilliance. The experiences of German commanders during World War II illustrate how a failure to grasp this principle can turn every battlefield achievement into a fleeting success. Ultimately, the war in Europe was decided as much by the relentless churn of American industry as by the soldiers who fought. German commanders never expected it, and that underestimation became, quietly and inevitably, the weapon that determined the outcome. The battlefield had become a mirror of the factories behind it, and the mirror always reflected American power.